This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. I can remember going to Yamaha headquarters in Milton Keynes, and this was like shortly after they had sent me an HX Stomp, because I did like a Helix native demo on YouTube back before there were really any subscribers particularly. I just tried out Helix native because I was like, well, that'd be interesting to try. Yeah, so they let me have an HX Stomp, which has obviously seen a lot of use. And then I think a couple of years, maybe a year or so into that, I was chatting to one of the reps. He wanted me to do some Helix stuff. But even way back then, like, you think about the Helix, why does it have all those inputs and outputs on it? It's not because the Helix is supposed to, in all cases, just replace an amp. It was never necessarily intended that the modelling stuff would totally replace your amp. Yes, it's like maybe in some ways a lot more tonal variety than amp. The things that we do in the digital modelling realm to try and make things feel right and sound right, especially when we're using in-ear monitors, I think can really be quite a detriment if you're then trying to bring that back to stage volume in some ways, right? Or being heard on stage. High cuts and low cuts and that sort of stuff. We're kind of getting rid of some of the things that would help us to be heard, if that was what we were looking for, because the monitoring situation is so much different to a real amp. If you have a real amp on stage, then front of house can get what it needs, but you also then have that real amp to sort of fill in the frequencies that maybe the modeling stuff you've sort of taken out to smooth the tones so that it's like a good direct sound. Maybe having an amp on stage kind of helps to fill those gaps. And actually really complements things well in a way like a dual amp setup can do, right? Where you've got like maybe a Vox or something lower headroom and then something higher headroom. It's kind of filling the gaps. This is something that I've sort of come to realise, and I think some other people are coming to realise this as well. Like, I was pleasantly surprised when I put out a Kemper story on Instagram asking like people, have you tried going between, you know, have you gone back to amps or have you tried doing both? That a lot of the like touring or pros that were answering this question were just saying, you know, it totally depends on the gig. You know, if it's certain types of gigs, then they'll use a real amp. If it's certain sessions, they'll use a real amp. But for certain international type stuff or stuff where you're using lots of in-ears, then there is the expectation that you'll go digital. And this is kind of was brought onto me by a chap called Joshua Parrish, who I gave a Skype lesson to back when the channel got hacked. And this guy he's very active in the Helix groups, but he's been someone who's used a Helix for a while and a Powercab. And basically he had this father-in-law brought a Deluxe Reverb along to plug into just in case, because he was having some trouble with his Powercab apparently. Josh spent quite a lot of time getting his tone down and getting the response sort of where he wanted it. He's a guy, I guess, like quite a lot of us, who does a mixture of gigs. Some of them like at a bar, like rock gigs with a band, where you're kind of just playing normal gigs, you know, like a lot of us. I've always run a modeler with a power amp and two 4x12 cabs in the past. I've run tube and solid state. I've never used the Helix that way so far, so this was the first time. I hadn't considered plugging straight up to an amp until I had planned to go direct. My father-in-law brought this amp just in case because I was having trouble with the Powercab last time we played together. I was pleasantly surprised since I couldn't figure out the routing on the spot to figure out the split to PA and still have a signal to the amp because I didn't have a monitor. So I just plugged into the amp and cranked it. It sounded great. I still miss the power amp and cab. So this is kind of one of those things where I think the FRF, I'm looking at one right now, the FRFR thing is an option. It's not the only option, but there's also, you know, if you've still got tube amps, I'm really enjoying, I've been on this for a couple of years now, this kind of experience of having a hybrid setup where on my board I have a couple of drives, I have an HX Stomp, and then depending on the gig, I can either go into an amp or sometimes I'll go into an FRFR, or like I gigged on Saturday, I had the Fractal FM9 because I knew that I was going to have to go into ears, and I took along an FRFR as well. So it's one of those things where it really does depend on the gig, but there is definitely, I think, a little bit of missing out going on where you like hunt the FRFR thing because that's what we assume is the way to go. Whereas I think actually dual amp setups, like that's a big part of the experimentation that I've done. And you know, you think like in the real world as well, where people have like, you know, that pedal show, the dual amp setup where it's like a wet and a dry and all that sort of thing. And you know, say if it's Chris Stapleton gigging live, there's 2 amps there at least, or John Mayer, there's like 3 amps. So why not, if you're going to be, you know, taking something shaped like an amp that is probably almost as heavy as an amp, as well as your modeling stuff, then it could totally just be an amp, right? And that's been a thing that it took me a while to sort of come around to. Like, after the first thing I did when I got a Kemper was, I was like, right, well, I'm going to start using a speaker live. And then in ear gigs, I was kind of thinking like, well, this is fine, but I was then trying things like putting an extra amp in the loop of the Kemper to try and get a bit more realism there. It's just one of those things where, totally dependent on the gig, taking something which is amp shaped and loud like an amp should totally be considered. So if it's like a bar gig, you know, like a club gig, like a certain size venue, then I'd always be taking an amp. Or if it's a gig where there's another guitarist who's going to be using an amp, so like I gig with my buddy Jake a fair amount these days, I don't think there's any way that I'd be able to keep up with him in a pleasant way if I was fully digital with the rig. I think it does really help sometimes to have an actual amp on stage. Seeing that someone else had that same kind of situation where it's like, well, maybe now a Deluxe Reverb could be something that actually I can take to a gig. If you're taking an FR to a gig anyway, then a Deluxe Reverb could probably go along with you. There's no reason to necessarily be totally purist on this either. Like, my tube amps aren't necessarily super reliable all the time, so to have some sort of FR solution as well was not a bad idea. Or maybe even like a Seymour Duncan power stage or something like that. But, you know, experimenting with these things that, you know, they put loops on the modelers for a reason, and, you know, lots of flexibility. It's because in some cases it might be a really good idea to take an amp maybe. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you've tried this, or are you done with this amp stuff, you're fed up with it, or have you been to gigs where you've been like, well, if that's how that guitarist is sounding and he doesn't have an amp, I don't want to sound like that, I want to be heard. I'd like to know your thoughts. Cheers for stopping by, and yeah.